Hey y'all, hope you're doing well. My name is Dave. I'm a senior in the class of 2021 at Walter Johnson High School in North Bethesda, Maryland. And today I'm going to be talking about the Montgomery County Public Schools Board of Education. So this is actually going to be what affects you the most as a student. And it's the most, directly capable thing for you to influence yourself as a student. Um, Okay, so who are they? So they're Montgomery County's Board of Education. It's the official educational policy making body in the county, excluding Montgomery College, who is they do their own thing, but it's all K through 12 education, public education in the county. So they're responsible for the direction and operation of the school system. So most of the actual direct oversight and management of MCPS, it happens with the central office, like superintendent staff, and then the board audits and empowers them. So the board themselves do a fair bit. We'll get into that. But it is the central office staff that are actually running the show. The board gets most of their funding from the county and a fair bit from the state. They have pretty much autonomy with the legislation. They can do pretty much whatever they want. Like, they have very little oversight from county, state, or federal. They have rules they have to comply with, but in terms of actually figuring out how to run the system, they pretty much have all of their own power. And they have 4 different standing committees. We'll get into in a minute. So according to the board's handbook, their primary responsibilities, or among their primary responsibilities, are they select and appoint the superintendent of schools. They formulate and then interpret their policies. They create operating and capital budgets. They continually are going to, appraise and investigate the educational and administrative management of our school system. They establish school boundaries, which has become a point of controversy in Montgomery County. They advance a legislative agenda. They appoint personnel, and they do a whole bunch of other administrative matters. Now, again, a lot of this stuff is happening, it's happening with staff, and then it's brought to the board, who will vote on it. But these are all technically, ultimately their decisions. So what's the difference between the Board of Education and the superintendent? So the board is elected by citizens of the county, and then they get to choose who the superintendent is. And so the board is making decisions for the school system, but the superintendent's kind of running the show. So here's some of the differences that they note. So the board develops and approves its policies, but then the superintendent interprets what they mean and actually works to carry them out and put them into practice. The superintendent makes recommendations, working with his staff for the capital and operating budgets of the county, and then the board makes an actual final determinations on what budget requests they submit to county council. Parents can appeal the decisions of the superintendent, which the board will then review. The board appoints personnel, which the superintendent then assigns to specific duties, and the superintendent will also provide for their professional development. The board has the legal title for all of our property and enters into contracts, and then the superintendent's going to monitor what's happening after those contracts. So again, it's a lot of the board does the actual legislating, and then the superintendent is going to go more specifically into what's happening, in the same way that sort of our county executive is the person who works with the legislation. But then our chief administrative officer is the one behind the scenes actually getting it done. So a little more about the superintendent. So they get elected by the board to 4-year terms, and they can decide, they can say to the board whether or not they would like to be nominated for another term. They can have, there's no term limit. And generally, we like our superintendents, we keep them around 15, 20 more years. According to our official law, the superintendent is the board's secretary, treasurer, and executive officer, none of which really mean that much. And the superintendent is not actually a member of the board, but they do sit at all board meetings, and they do have a lot of power. The superintendent makes recommendations for all the board's meeting agendas, and can call some special meetings with outside groups like our labor unions and our student governments. It's the board's representative in our contract negotiations with labor unions, which we have a lot of labor unions. The teachers have a union. The service employees have a union. The administrators have a union. The superintendent makes recommendations for all major personnel appointments, where we have a bunch. We have an entire network of bureaucracy of all sorts of different departments in central office, all of whom the superintendent will have to make a recommendation for who we want to head the office. And so just generally, the superintendent's responsible for running MCPS. They do the tasks behind the scenes. They make sure that they know what's going on and that they're in control and they're driving the ship. And then the board audits and reviews their job every year. They have a whole process for it, and they, use that information to decide, do we keep the superintendent around? Do we want to get rid of them? So obviously, being a superintendent, you have to work really hard. It's not a stable job. There is very little job security. You have to do a really good job or we're going to get rid of you. And handling a ship as big as MCPS with our 165,000 students, 20,000 staff, it's not an easy task. So while we pay our superintendent really well, like $400,000 a year, it's not exactly an easy job. But yeah, getting into the board. So there's 7 adult members and there's 1 student member of the board we call a SMOB. And the adult members, they are elected for 4-year terms. The SMOB is elected for 1 year, could run again. There's no term limits for any of them. Adult members, so for the 7 members, there are 5 districts and 2 at-large seats. But what's weird about it is with our districts, like, you have to live in the district. And you can only run for a member of a district that you live in, but it's not just the people in the district who vote on it. It's the people from the entire county get to vote for every district, which is weird. And then the at-large seats, you can live wherever and run for them. So all members of the board, they have to be registered voters. Obviously, it means you have to be over 18. If you're in a district, you have to live in the district. And they can't be subject to the authority of the board. So what that means is if you're a teacher or if you're an administrator, you have to run. If you run and you win, you have to resign from your job, which happened recently. In 2020, Lynn Harris ran for an at-large seat. She won. She had been a teacher. She had to resign from her job as a teacher in order to go sit on the board. So it's weird for when we have elections because 2 districts and 1 at-large seat have their elections in presidential years, and then 3 districts in the other at-large seat have their elections 2 years later in our gubernatorial years, our 2022, 2026 years. And so the board's composition and its pay and these elections and whatnot, so that's determined by the Maryland State Legislature, which for the most part, the way school boards all across the state, it'll be the county's like representatives who bring their recommendations to the state, and the state will usually approve them. But that doesn't always happen. Like, for example, so our Board of Education, it's better paid than most counties, but it's not really paid that much still. It's only paid about $25,000 a year, which means it really can't be a full-time job, but the demands are so much that it's really hard for it to be a part-time job. All of our board members who have it as a part-time job complain about dealing with their other jobs. But when we try to raise this, the state legislature pretty much just laughs at us because they think, oh, Montgomery County is already very progressive. We're not going to pay their board members more, which is kind of a problem. Our board is also unique in that it's fully elected, which is rather uncommon. A lot of boards are at least partially, if not fully appointed by the county's government. So here's a look at our districts. Currently, we have our 5 districts. Again, this will be redrawn by the state legislature, but at the request of the Montgomery County delegation in 2022. We do redistricting every 10 years, just the same time as the county council, state legislature, and House of Representatives all do it. It's right after the census. We get our new data official. And I wouldn't expect this map to change too much. We don't really know what's going to happen, but like the districts haven't changed all that much. Voting patterns haven't changed all that much. We're not expanding or shrinking the size of districts. So I would generally expect it to look a lot like this for years to come. We'll see if that happens, but I wouldn't expect it to change. So our student member of the board. So with a very small exceptions for a couple of rare circumstance personnel matters, our student member of the board has the full voting rights as every other adult member. Like they are a full member of the board. And this is super rare. I'll show you a map in a second. But this is super rare. Most SMOBs in the state do not have full voting rights like this. And it's even more interesting that in closed sessions, when we have our discussion about these personnel matters that the students can't vote on, if a majority of the board agrees, the student can show up and they can even like make or second like motions to pass bills, but they can't actually vote, which is super weird. And I'm not sure what's up with that, but that's fun. So to be a student member of the board, you have to be a junior or a senior enrolled in an MCPS high school. So at most you can serve for 2 years, which happened a few years ago. Eric Gershie did it. Usually SMOBs will only last 1 year, and it's usually going to be a senior. And so there's what we call the SMOBCon, which is a whole convention where there's delegates from like middle and high schools who all come together and they vote on everybody who's filed to run for SMOB, and they pick the top 2 candidates. And then all MCPS middle and high schoolers get to vote between these 2 candidates who are chosen, which basically we end up with very similar SMOBs. It's going to be almost the same 2 candidates. There'll be very little difference between them in policy positions in any given year. And there's very little difference year to year on our SMOBs. Obviously, some are better than others, but in general, they all fit into the same general mold. So technically, as a student member of the board, you're expected to prioritize your education. But this doesn't happen too much. SMOBs will take, 3 or 4 classes opposed to traditional 7 or 8. They still complain about being severely overworked. I've spoken with some, I won't name them. But generally, they're being asked to be full-time members of the board, but also full-time students. And that is an incredible ask on them. But at least, despite all this stress, they get $5,000 scholarship, 250 SSL hours, and a social studies credit for being a SMOB. So, it's a trade-off. And so Montgomery County is really progressive with our 1 full voting student member. But it would be honestly good to keep going further, to keep uplifting student voices, because there are 165,000 students. That's the biggest constituency affected by the board. This is an opinion here, but I think, if we had more SMOBs, that would be great, because we're considered progressive relative to other counties in the state, but it's still not super progressive, and we're only getting 1 student's voice at the table. So again, here's a map my friend Brian made. It's a list of how many voting rights SMOBs have. And so, like I said, it's Montgomery and Anne Arundel County. Those are the only counties in the state that give full or pretty much full voting rights to their SMOBs. And then, in other areas around like Baltimore and DC areas, like there's partial voting rights, and there's movements in some of those counties to expand the voting rights. But in general, student members of the board have very, very little voting rights in this county, which is not good, because students need a voice at the table when it's their education. And there's even been worse things, like in Howard County, parents are suing to get the voting rights of the student member taken away because the student was disagreeing with what they wanted, which is terrible. So in general, student voices are just not super respected in the state of Maryland. They're better in Montgomery County, but still not perfect. So board meetings, they usually conduct 2 business meetings per month, which happen on Tuesdays, just like the county council. I'm not sure why everybody loves Tuesdays. The time when they're having their meetings can be moved around. They post their schedule on their website. The public can and should come and testify at these meetings and give their opinions on things, and shape board influence. And all of our meetings that we have, except for closed sessions on I'll get into in a minute what those mean. But all of these meetings are going to be open to the public. Maryland has very strict open meeting laws. So the board also has hearings on a bunch of things, including our capital budget and our operating budget, and a look at school boundaries, which has been controversial because, some of our schools are overcrowded, some of our schools are underfilled, and there's a bunch of parents who don't want their kids going to different schools. And so we've had massive fights about whether we want to redo our boundaries. The officers, which are president and vice president, since the superintendent takes up everything else, they're elected at our annual organizational meeting in December. So again, they change every year. These tend to stick around generally with the same people, but they can change. So outside of board's business meetings, there are 4 committees will meet regularly. The board also sometimes meet with groups like our labor unions, our student governments, our parent-teacher associations. They have annual retreats, like for bonding purposes. But all of these meetings, including their retreats, they have to comply with Maryland's like super strict open meeting laws, which are so strict the board could not legally have a group chat without posting every single thing that they say in that group chat publicly on the internet, and just publishing it for anybody to be able to see. So at their meetings, all of their legislation has to pass with 5 votes, which is a simple majority. When the swab's not allowed to vote, it needs 4 votes, which is again a simple majority. And if a board member brings up new business that's not on the agenda, any final action on it, so that's like an official vote on it, they leave it until the next meeting unless the board decides with unanimous consent that they want to take final action on it, which is another effort to ensure like the public gets to express their opinions on everything. The board wants to hear your opinions. So what's a closed session? So when they have really like sensitive matters, so like debating about personnel to hire, lawsuits, labor, collective bargaining, anything that is protected by law from public disclosure, the board can have closed sessions, which are not open to the public. So we don't technically officially know what goes on in them, but they have to disclose what they talked about. And every board member is responsible for ensuring that they stay on topic of discussion that qualifies for closed session. So they're not allowed to go off on rants that we should be hearing at public meetings. And then what's really interesting is they had a lawsuit come up recently, like in the last 10 years, where there was a member disclosing information from closed session, and the board didn't like this. And so they went to the county, and what eventually the county attorney decided was the board doesn't have any power to discipline their members for disclosing this closed session information, but they are allowed to post a resolution that informs the public just how mad they are about it. So that should tell you, a little bit about, the board's overall authority, which is not that much. Like they have autonomy, but they don't have that much authority within their own, power, if that makes sense. So their committees, they have 4 standing committees. They have the fiscal management, which looks at our money resources. They have policy management, which develops and amends our policies for the board to vote on. We have special populations, which is for students who are gifted or have special needs, alternative programs, ESOL. And we have strategic planning, which is going to be, our like long-term decisions and like ensuring that like we're working towards our real goals in MCPS. The board also has like some advisory committees. They can create more advisory committees. These are from like citizens. They'll come in sometimes, like recently renaming what's now Odessa Shannon Middle School. They brought in the public to ensure that we got a list of names that they liked. And all of these committee meetings, they're also open to the public, but unlike the business meetings, the public cannot come testify at these. Okay, so budget development. So the capital budget is going to be like infrastructure projects, building things, as opposed to operating budget, which is like paying employees and everyday work. So we have these things called clusters, which is a high school and all of the middle and elementary schools that feed into it. And every cluster has a representative. So they identify problems within their clusters and propose solutions, and then they send them to the superintendent. And the superintendent publishes a recommended 6-year capital improvements program every 2 years, or amendments to it in the other years, and a 1-year capital budget after they go through a bunch of work sessions. Then the board holds more work sessions on this proposed budget, and they have public hearings on it, and they have more work sessions. And eventually they send this budget to the county executive and the county council, who take these requests into consideration when they're forming their own budgets for the year. NCPF takes about 65% of its funding from the county. And then the state General Assembly, our legislature, it also has hearings. And we might, we'll get money from this. We'll get about 25% of our money from the state. And then the remainder comes from a bunch of weird different places, including federal. But again, its majority is coming from the county and the state. When we make our operating budget, we use pretty much the exact same process, the capital budget, except we have a little more autonomy. Like after final decisions are made, we can still adjust things here and there. But again, budget is one of the things that's like furthest removed. Like we get to make our recommendations, but then the executive and the council, they go duke it out, and they have to decide officially how much money we're getting. And then, that MCPS doesn't really get to do anything about it. They can keep requesting more money, but they don't have, direct access, and they get money. Some money is required by law according to the number of students that we officially have from the state and the county. But there's also just a lot of you throw out your budget and you see what you get. So there's not a guaranteed amount of money year to year. Okay. So unlike the county council and the county executives, which can only get people removed if they have an actual disability, the county council can remove a board member for immorality, misconduct in office, incompetence, or willful neglect of duty. So basically not being a good board member. And if this happens, if there's a vacancy because they were removed or because somebody resigns or because somebody dies, the remaining board members get to vote to appoint a replacement, which has to be, again, a qualified voter and from the same district if the vacancy is a district seat. If the SMOB is the position that's vacant, then it goes down to the runner-up from the last election. And another interesting thing to note is if the board members don't make proper financial disclosure statements, they can get removed for that too. So there's a lot of ways in which they have to be very careful about their jobs. And even candidates have to do these same financial disclosure statements. And again, if they got elected and they messed those up, they won't get seated, or maybe they'll get seated and removed immediately. But we're very careful to ensure that we have a very transparent process and we're avoiding corruption in the board. Okay, so how do you interact with the board? So the biggest thing, if you want to make your opinions heard, and I do this very, very regularly, you do public testimony. So there's 15 slots for the public to come in and talk at any meeting. There's 10 for items that are on their agenda and 5 more slots for items that are not on their agenda. And you'll get 3 minutes to speak. And normally when we're not in a pandemic, it can be kind of difficult to deal with the board meetings, especially when they come during school hours, because you're expected to go there during school hours, go all the way to Rockville. And even if this is an excused absence, it's kind of a problem that it's so inaccessible to students, because the board's not going to hear 100% of the opinions on the situations. And during the pandemic, it's been better because anybody can just go and they send in a video testimony. And you can do that ahead of time, which is nice. But generally, public testimony, it's great, and do it. Make your opinions heard. It's fantastic. You can email me at davetalkslocalpolitics@gmail.com, and I will tell you so much about how you can testify. But the board also needs to work harder on, making it more accessible to the public. So if it's not just opinions, if you want to actually take up a specific formal issue, which would be something like, final actions of a superintendent that are a problem. If personnel get suspended or fired, that's a problem. If a student's suspended for 10 or more days, or if they're expelled, you can file an appeal with the board, and they will take that up and they will look at it, and they will eventually, do their quasi-judicial actions on it, which will be a final decision. Or if you don't want to go quite this formal, you can take an informal alternative, which is you call something called the ombudsman, which is basically just the board staff, and they will try and answer your questions. They can't, it's not the same as an appeal, but they will at least be able to tell you what's going on. And this board staff, they're super responsive. So you can communicate with them directly, and they'll tell you a lot of what's going on. And all MCPS employee, board members and central office and teachers and all that, all of their email addresses are posted on the internet. So you can email them as well, and they will get back to you. The board is super responsive. MCPS is super responsive. They want to hear what you have to say. They want to work with you. You can make change happen. I've been doing a lot of work with the board, and you can make them listen to you, and you can make them take serious steps towards what you want to do. So if you care about education, if you care about changing the way your school system treats you, no matter what it is, go talk to the board, and they will listen, and they will, act on it. So here's a list of the things you can look at about the board. Feel free to go digging through those. Thanks for watching. I hope you're having a great day, and I'll see you next time. There's more in this playlist on, videos. We've got county legislature, county executive. We've got a bunch of stuff about the Maryland state government. This is the fun stuff in school boards. Feel free to reach out to me. Again, it's davetalkslocalpolitics@gmail.com. I would love to talk about boards with you. But yeah, have a great day.